Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my talk and this session. My name is Teddy Seyed. I'm a PhD student at the University of Calgary, and this work is in collaboration with Dr. Xing-Dong Yang from Dartmouth and Dr. Dan Vogel from Waterloo. So our work is essentially a modular smartphone for lending, and at a very high level that means we're using modularity to improve trustworthiness and convenience when we're sharing our smartphones. So this is probably you've seen very often. You've probably already done it at this conference, and you're probably going to do it more during this conference. And this is the idea that we're all around a table, we're eating our food, having a drink, just generally chilling, and we're using our devices. Now, when we're using our devices, we're sharing emails, we're sharing pictures, we're maybe playing a game, we're showing a screenshot, things like that. So sharing happens quite often and more often than you think. So from a lot of the related work, we've seen sort of three key areas. The first is that family relationships really influence how desktop computers are being shared. So in the case of a husband and wife, they would share their desktop differently than they would a husband and his child. Secondly, things like basic apps are the things that are shared most commonly. So things like maps, browsers, music, a Spotify playlist, or even games. Lastly, culture plays a serious role as well in terms of how we share our devices. So in the cases of India, where there may only be one phone in the household, how they're sharing that device is different. As well, your background and culture also influences how you share. There's also this notion of trust and convenience, which is something I mentioned at the very beginning. And this plays a huge role in how we share our devices. So in this example, I'm going to highlight a specific scenario. So let's say the person on the right using their tablet and their phone dies, or their tablet dies. Now, the person on the left wants to lend their phone to the person on the right, but it's really inconvenient for him because of distance. He may feel uncomfortable because he's so far away from his device. Next, we can look at convenience. So let's imagine these two ladies on the left are both really close friends and they've kind of grown up with each other. The person on the right is someone who's kind of new to the group and doesn't really understand or really know everyone in the group very well. Now, the two on the left are probably very familiar with each other, and so they share things quite often, but they might feel very uncomfortable in terms of trust sharing some stuff with the person on the right. So this is what I mean by the balancing between trust and convenience. Now, we know from related work that there is a sense of risk between the lender and the lendee. So in terms of the lender, there's a risk in the sense that if I give my phone away to someone, I might worry that I may not get it back or I don't know what they're doing. But on the flip side, for the lendee, if someone's borrowed my phone and they've logged into their email, if they forget to log out of their email, it might actually feel kind of weird or they might feel kind of risky. Proximity actually dictates significantly in terms of how we share our devices. So if someone's right beside me and I share my device, I'm probably more willing and more comfortable. But if they're further away, I might be more awkward because I don't know what's going on that screen. Lastly, we've kind of seen the fact that Android already uses things like guest mode and guest sharing in their operating system. But things like multi-account, things like they're not used very well. And we've seen work from Brush and InkPen that this is actually user-unfriendly. So it's very, very difficult to basically continue your session, log out of your phone, and then hand it over to someone, so it's unfriendly. Now, on the research side, we've had a few influences. We've looked at things like Codex, Paddle, Siftables, and Doppio, where they're using multiple screens, but they're not really focused on sharing. On the research, or on the commercial side, we have things like Project Era from Google, Motorola Z, and LG 5. So these are all commercially available. They're all modular devices. However, they're looking at using modularity to upgrade their phone or increase functionality, whereas we're using modularity to basically turn your device into a shareable thing. Now, before I jump into the cool demos and videos, I'll talk a little bit about our grounding work. So this is the work that we did that inspired a lot of the work that we did later on. So the first thing we did was an exploratory study. So we looked at how people shared their devices, what apps they were sharing, how the relationships that influenced their sharing, things like that. So our exploratory study was first a 15-minute survey that we used SurveyMonkey for with 54 participants who are all from the States. We basically framed our lending scenarios in 3 different scenarios. So these are all based off of prior work. So these are scenarios that looked at family or close friends, coworkers or classmates, and strangers. So you can imagine sharing is going to be substantially different in each of these 3 scenarios. So we gave people these 3 scenarios. We looked at 2 techniques, the first being handing your phone over unlocked to someone, and the next one being using a guest mode, so something that's already available in Android. So we asked people to think about how they were lending, different sort of context, and how they were sharing. At the very end of the survey, we then introduced the concept of lending and whether that would be a good future direction. So from our work, we've basically had 3 key takeaways. The first is that we essentially confirmed a lot of the related work in terms of relationships did play a big role in how people shared their devices. So if they were really close to someone, it was basically all or nothing. all being you handed someone your phone over unlocked, or nothing at all. The next was comparing unlocked phone techniques versus modularity. We saw that people actually preferred using a modular approach in this scenario with a coworker or classmate. And lastly, people were generally unwilling to share their device with people they didn't know. So you can kind of already see in our initial work that we're actually kind of framing how a device might actually work for future modular devices. So following that, we actually did a pretty cool study, which is looking at how we can detach things, how we break things apart, and we called that a modular design study. So we came up with 6 different designs of how you would actually modularize a phone, and I'll kind of jump into each of those in a second. So the first was what we call the back-to-back design. So this is a phone with 2 screens facing the opposite direction, and you can kind of slide it off. The next was sort of the SIM card design. So there's a SIM card large, which is on the right, and a SIM card small, which is on the left. So it's just different sizes of the modular piece. And this works very similar to a SIM card, where it just kind of pops out from the side. The next, and I personally found the most interesting, was the idea of multiple pieces. So you have a 6-piece, a 4-piece, and a 2-piece. And as you can tell, they kind of each basically break apart differently. On the one on the right, the far right, the 2-piece, it kind of breaks in half. So in our study for this design, we had 12 participants. They were aged 20 to 35. We asked them a bunch of follow-up questions, very similar to our initial study where we looked at different scenarios. We asked them how they'd be using these different designs in different scenarios. We got them to try it out, and then they ended up ranking their favorite design. So generally from this study, we had really encouraging results. So people were definitely more encouraged to share, and they had the feeling of more control, especially in this case of the stranger. So now that we know that people definitely want to share more and that there's a sense of control, that kind of gives us a grounding to actually continue more work in building a future device. Now in terms of the ranking, we saw some interesting results. So my personal favorite was the 6-piece design, which only had 4%, sadly. But the one that was preferred the most was the SIM card design large with 41%, followed by the back-to-back at 24, and the SIM card small at 19. What's also interesting is you can kind of see, and I'll touch on it a little bit later, is that the multi-piece designs were ranked the lowest. And interestingly, the 2% one, I'll kind of touch on later, wasn't really well received at all. So I won't have a lot of time to talk about sort of all of the findings we had from our modular design study, but there's 8 main takeaways that I'll touch upon really briefly. So the first was this notion of retaining a piece increases trust. So right now with a smartphone currently, I give away my phone, and like I've kind of lost the sense of trust. But if I maintain a piece of that phone and I give it away, I still feel like I have something with me. So that means there's kind of a level of trust that really wasn't there before. The next one was this notion of controlling trust piece by piece size. So this was interesting to me because something I hadn't thought of until we had done our study, where it meant when I gave away a bigger piece to someone, that meant I trusted them more. And if I gave them away a smaller piece, I trusted them a bit less. Now on the flip side for a lendee, their trust is now visible to me. So if I know that you have a bigger piece and you've given me a smaller piece, I know you trust me less. So I thought that was really cool. Something else that came up quite often was the idea that people really wanted to monitor the piece. So even if it was a secure sandbox device, they still want to be able to know what someone was doing on that device just for that sense of security and trust. We also saw people were interested in sharing other content. So it's not just about splitting apart a phone and giving a piece of it away, but now it's the notion that you're actually sharing content as well. There was this notion of keeping a complete phone, and this is where I mentioned the modular pieces or the multi-piece designs failed horribly, was because people really wanted to feel that they had a complete phone. So if you can imagine the piece that had 2 screens and I split it in half, I go from having a complete phone to a phone that it feels like half. So now the lendee feels like they have half a phone and the lender feels like they have half a phone. Next, there was this notion of master and slave that came up quite often, where the main piece was always the master and the secondary piece was always the slave. And lastly, form factor was also an important aspect as well. So I'll touch on it a little bit briefly in the next slide, but in terms of the 2-piece and the 4-piece and the 6-piece, the important part of there was aspect ratio. It wasn't maintained when you're splitting apart the device. So it may go from being a complete 16:9 device to a smaller 4:3. So from all this, we essentially generated design considerations on both the hardware side and the software side. So I'll talk about the hardware side really briefly. So I've touched upon this already, but modules should maintain the aspect ratio, especially in the multi-piece designs. Larger pieces implicitly mean more trust. And also, interestingly, smaller pieces mean limited functionality. So if I know that I trust you less, it doesn't really make sense to give full functionality to the smaller piece. So by inherently, that means the smaller piece should have limited functionality. In terms of modularity, we really saw that people didn't prefer breaking apart the phone. and I'll kind of touch upon that at the finality of this conclusion, or of this talk, but essentially sliding is far more preferred than it is breaking apart. In terms of lending, people really wanted lending to be integrated into the OS, so we've kind of seen that already with Android and having their guest mode, so kind of similar concept of keeping it really integrated fundamentally into the OS. The ability to remove to lend a device, but also keep it fully customizable. So this means detaching should really be easy with the device, and it should sort of switch into a mode already, but then also customizing for the different lending modes that are options or that are available. So we already have, you know, friends and family, coworkers and classmates, and then strangers. So switching between those modes should be really easy. Again, kind of having that sort of control between the lender and the lendee. So the lendee should also feel safe. So the idea that the lendee has logged into their email, and once that device is returned, it should log them out. And also the idea that the roles should be swapped. So if I trust someone enough and I give them the bigger piece, it shouldn't be a problem for me to switch to the smaller piece. So now we jump into the cool stuff that I really like, and that's the actual prototype. As you can kind of tell, oh, it's not playing. Oh, it didn't play. So this is our 3D printed prototype. It's a little bit larger than we wanted. Essentially, it houses a Nexus 6, a phone, and there's sliding rails in between. You can slide it out to the left. It props up a menu. There's also a smaller piece. That is the smaller piece. Oh, there we go. So yeah, this is the 3D printed piece. As you can kind of tell, it's a little bit large. Nexus 6. There's sliding rails on the back. As you can kind of tell, we're playing off the idea of a smaller piece and a bigger piece. The larger piece is a Nexus 4 that slides in, and there's a smaller piece as well. It slides in as well. So here we're already playing with the idea that there's a larger piece, bigger piece. So next I'll kind of jump into some examples of what it means to be sharing your device. So in this example, I'm essentially going to do what I talked about earlier, where I pull the device off and it's really easy to lend. So in this case, the minute I pull it off, it's going to default to a menu, and if I pull it further, it's going to default into what we call a guest mode. You can kind of see the icons locked. So we basically give access to things like maps, phone calls, and pictures, so things that are very common that you don't really need access for right away. So you pull it out, there's a little menu. If I pull it further, it's going to default to the guest mode, and I can take it. Next, there's a bunch of guest modes, or lending modes that I kind of mentioned earlier. So things around family and friends, coworkers, etc. So there's a bunch of different modes that are available in our little menu. The first one is app lending, which is basically lending an app directly. So you can imagine I open up Gmail, and I select lending, I can give that app away. So this might be useful for scenarios where I don't really know how to answer an email, and I want someone else to type it up for me. They can do that. Guest mode is essentially what you saw earlier, where it's just straight detaching, but now you can select it explicitly. Next is full access, where it's full access between both devices, so they're essentially the same device. After that is screen sharing, where it's just sharing the screen one way and swapping control. So app lending works the following way. So let's say I open up Gmail and I'm browsing my email, and someone wants to browse and check their email. So I'll pull it off to the side. I can select the app lending. It'll open up Gmail. So here, as I mentioned before, it's a really easy way to select just the sandbox application for a specific scenario. So in this case, me just sharing the email app only. So there's also this notion of requesting access that we talk about quite often during the paper. And this is the notion that if things are sandboxed and someone requests access for an application, it happens. So I'll just show you a quick example. So I'm going to pull it off straight to be in guest mode. I'm going to open up Gmail, and now it's going to tell me that I can't open it. And I need to request access. So this then goes directly to the phone, and it's integrated into the OS as a notification, and I can either say yes or no. And so I'll click yes, and the app will be approved on the secondary device, and then you can use it. Screen sharing is just a one-way sort of demonstration of how screen sharing would work on an application like this. So the idea here is just one way. It's really good for things like showing how to use a phone if someone doesn't know how to access a specific feature, or showing a phone pictures, an album. Full access, as I mentioned before, is just essentially mirroring both phones and giving full access to the device, but very sandboxed. So I'll select the unlock icon, and then they'll both be equal. So one of the things I mentioned before was the ability to monitor the pieces, and so regardless of where you are in in a lending session, there is a notion that things are always monitored. So at the very top, there's always a persistent notification of what's going on the secondary piece of the screen. You can kind of see it as a notification, and you can open it up fully. And you can also look at an activity log if they've opened up other apps during their lending session. Lastly, this small piece is a little bit different than the bigger piece. So I already mentioned before that the smaller piece should, by definition, already have limited functionality. So we've kind of already done that in this case, where the guest mode by default is really essentially just the phone. That's all that can ever be accessed. So this is that scenario where you're letting to phone someone on the street. You don't really know them. You can pull it off and select it. Now also, we can still do the same sort of swap scenario that I mentioned before, where if I trust someone fully and I only ever want to use a small piece, I can swap control, full control. So that's selected by pulling it off and getting a secondary menu, selecting swap. Now you kind of see the icons are locked again, so it's a guest mode by default on the larger screen. And the smaller piece retains the full functionality of the bigger piece with the notifications and everything else included. So for future work, there's a few different things that we can do. I definitely want to make it thinner than what you see in the prototype, and I know how to do that now, but the purposes of MITting for UIST, you have to do what you have to do. Alternative design, so looking at even more modularity. So I really like the 6-piece design, but obviously it wasn't really well received. But I think in scenarios where there's more sharing or maybe multiplayer gaming might actually be a really cool way to do modularity on a phone. There might actually be other sharing influencers, so we only looked at trust and convenience because that seemed to be the biggest issue with sharing devices today. And so we could definitely do other ones. We only looked at lending, we didn't really look at lending content within applications, so that might be something where we look at sharing a photo album within the actual applications of the devices. We also didn't really look at too much at real-world usage. We did very limited user studies in a lab, but that's something that we could explore further. So to conclude, we explored the design space of a modular smartphone, and we demonstrated how this could be improved to enhance trust and convenience in devices today. Thank you.
So we can take a few questions if you just go up to the microphone. As we're waiting for that brave person, just a quick question. Did the people that you were studying know that when they shared a piece of their phone, that their phone would be degraded in some ways? Or was it the design was that they would always have the same robust functionality on their phone?
They knew.
So the idea was that they'd have the same...
Yeah, the idea was that they would have a very sandboxed sort of environment because you didn't want to give them full access to information on the main piece.
Right.
So it was ever meant to be a sandboxed experience.
And the second question is, was there a scenario where you thought this design worked the best in terms of a particular use case that you thought, oh, this is a really sweet spot?
Yeah, so a lot of the people that had kids or parents essentially thought this would be the best case device where you could detach the piece and give it to the child, and it'd be very sandboxed. They couldn't ever install thousands of dollars worth of apps or things like that.
Great. Oh, we have one brave.
Hi.
Hey.
I would be interested in learning how you think you can make it thinner, because it seems like these were using like off-the-shelf components that you slotted together.
So this is a funny story. So I was actually in China and Shenzhen, and I was trying to buy iPhone parts to make this out of an iPhone minus the case and everything, which is fine if you know how to speak Chinese, but they wouldn't sell me any parts that I wanted to make. So I would ideally basically take existing parts, remove all the cases, and just reprint a lot of the stuff that already exists today.